Islamist, in particular, is a politicized term that has come into general usage in I guess, the past decade or two. An Islamist is someone who takes the Quran in a very literal 7th century way. And I guess the best examples are the Wahhabis, who didn't even exist until the 19th century. Their leader, Wahhab, lived from the very beginning of the 18th century to the very end, 1701 or 2, something like that, to the 90s. And then it was his followers during the 19th century who began to organize and institutionalize the practices that he promoted that were very much in keeping with the ways that people lived in the 7th century. There were some people who took this to extremes. There's an example of a group in northern Nigeria from the 1980s, the Metetsini Muslims who wouldn't wear wristwatches because there were none in the 7th century, who wouldn't wear clothes with zippers because there were no zippers then. So taking it to extremes, which is amazing because Muhammad himself was a very reasonable and practical person who would find this to be total nonsense. And the Wahhabis are significant because they are tied to Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. They are the ones we think of when we try to understand why it is that women are not allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. So this notion of men being in charge of the other half of society and restrictive attitudes about human relations, these come from this particular preacher who is very much a recent development in Islam. So when you see the word Islamist, we're talking about someone who politicizes Islam for his, and it's usually his own agenda, and it's very restrictive and very patriarchal, and usually fairly anti-Western as well. So an Islamist is very different from someone who is Islamic. And you're right, Islam comes from the root in Arabic, which has the consonants S, L, and M. That is also the root for salam, which means peace. Islam means acceptance of the will of God, which is peace. A Muslim is someone who practices acceptance of the will of God. So the suffix that you put on at the end makes a big difference in what you actually mean. And a lot of people don't know that there's a difference there. So it's important that we let people know the difference. The idea that Muslims want to convert everyone in the world, well, this is news to me. I sat and talked to Muslim women in the Emir's Palace in northern Nigeria in Kano for a year and a half before any discussion of religion came up, and only then because I raised the issue, comparing rituals in Catholicism, which I knew best, with rituals in Islam. And I asked the woman I was talking to, who was one of the wives of the Emir, why she hadn't talked to me about this before. And she said, you know, your God is my God is your God, and if you are interested in how I worship, I'm very happy to talk to you about it. But until and unless you ask me, I am not going to impose anything on you, because unless you're interested, there's no point in our talking about this. And I had that response from many, many people I worked with in the field in northern Nigeria, in Morocco, people I met in Turkey, people in Ghana. People who try to actively convert people to Islam are not practicing Islam in the way that it was intended at the beginning. In fact, one of the most frequently cited sayings of the Prophet Muhammad is, "Let there be no compulsion in religion." And by compulsion, he meant force, that nobody was required to be Muslim, to convert to Islam. As the woman in the palace explained to me, if it comes to a point where you ask me, how can I be like you? Then I will tell you about my religion, because it's my religion that makes me who I am. And that's when we can talk about religion. So a Muslim who knows the Quran and knows the stories of the Prophet Muhammad, the hadiths, will never try to force anyone to convert to Islam, especially because if you are Jewish or Christian, and more recently, even if you're not one of the Abrahamic faiths, maybe Hindu, maybe Native American, maybe Zen Buddhist, Muslim people respect other people of faith. And they are just as likely to ask you about your faith and want to learn about that. Those who are trying to convert usually are people who do not know the Quran very well. I would like to add that this word jihad is always a difficult word. Journalists in the West have glossed it as holy war. And it can be holy war, but only in the circumstance in which there is no other defense, bodily, physical defense of yourself and your family and your community. Jihad is supposed to be personal. Jihad does not mean holy war, except in that one circumstance. It means struggle. The Prophet Muhammad is known to have returned from the battlefront, and as he came home from the battlefront, he said, we have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. And what he meant by that was, now that we're not out on the battlefield, we're back at home, going about our daily business, and our personal daily struggle toward perfection is the hardest struggle that any individual can ever have. And this is why Muslims are not supposed to be judging other people, because the belief is, until and unless you yourself are perfect, which we know is not possible in this world, then you have no business judging somebody else. So jihad is your own personal struggle, your psychological struggle, your spiritual struggle. One of my books is called One Woman's Jihad. She was not a battle fighter. Her jihad was teaching people and talking to her colleagues about spiritual issues and social organization. And it was really the Jewish notion of tikkun olam, and I'm probably saying that wrong, but the idea of mending the world, and this is very much part of the pillar zakat, and it's tied to people's personal jihads. So maybe we need to use that word more often in our vocabulary, our daily vocabulary, so that we can pull it away from this notion of killing. It's not supposed to mean that at all.